thanks to SPE for the privilege to come and share some thoughts on this very hot topic we're looking at today. I think it's well established that the national aspiration is for us to grow to 2 million barrels next year, and by 2030 get to 3 million barrels. As has been enunciated upon in the earlier sessions, is this achievable? The answer is yes, it's achievable. But I think we need to frame the conversation a bit more differently. The conversation is not about can we achieve it. The conversation should be around what type of 3 million barrels are we talking about? Because we know that the number of barrels alone does not build sustainable value. What is probably more important is how those barrels are produced, at what cost, with what data integrity, under what sort of fiscal framework, and with what sort of environmental footprints. It's then that our barrel can truly count for barrel. And I like the way the keynote speaker described this as intelligent barrels. I think there are three key things that should be fundamentally in place as we look at the issue of capital allocation for these 3 million barrels. The first one, and the three of them, by the way, are all extract from the theme for this particular summit. The first one is around digitalization. Why is it important? Because it forms the foundation for intelligent operations. And if we're serious about the target of the 3 million barrels, we must be serious about building the digital infrastructure that makes each one of those barrels intelligent, that makes sure that we are producing them at the right costs, from the right zone, at the right time, with full data traceability right from the reservoir to revenue. The second thing we must pay attention to, and that plays very prominently in the construct of capital allocation, is capital itself, because that's the fuel that powers the engine. McKinsey opines that we need between $30 to $50 billion of cumulative capex spend in the upstream in order to get from 1.8 million barrels to 3 million barrels. And this will span, of course, new field development, brownfield optimization, gas infrastructure, and export system rehabilitation. All this will come from operators. They will come from outside of operators, from financiers, international project financiers. They will come from DFIs. They will come from domestic capital. But what we've seen and what we've noticed is that capital does not naturally flow to targets. Capital flows to transparency. Capital flows to predictability. Capital flows to demonstrated returns. If I will borrow the language of my fellow panelists, the 3 R's, and I love the way he put it. It's about the reserves, it's about the returns, and it's about the risk. So it's not just enough for us to announce a 3 million barrel in a policy document. As operators, and I'm one of the operators, our own challenge is to present financiers with real-time production data, with auditable reserves, with stress-tested economic models and credible ESG metrics. The third thing is around policy frameworks, and this is what is the architecture that builds everything together. We're grateful for the enactment of the PIA, but enactment of PIA in itself is not enough. It is the implementation that is the key issue. And for us to achieve 3 billion barrels and incentivize the capital allocation, our policies must evolve to support the digitization and capital mobilization agenda in every facet, whether you are calling it the NDR and so on and so forth. And for us, the glue that keeps everything together is how we harmonize them. So think about this. Digitization without capital produces pilot projects that never scale. We have impressive dashboards, but no production data. Capital without digitization produces investments that underperform. Wells drilled without adequate subsurface data, facilities built without predictive maintenance capability, assets acquired without the digital infrastructure to optimize them. Now, digitization and capital without the supportive policy framework will only produce frustrated operators. Companies with the tools and the funding were trapped in regulatory frameworks and bottlenecks. And that's the dysfunctionality that we need to deal with in order to be able to properly dimension the issue of capital mobilization. I think the magic happens when the three are harmonized together. When we talk about digitization, we talk about policy, and we talk about capital. And for us, the target is 3 million barrels. The ambition must not just be any 3 million barrels. It must be 3 million intelligent, optimized, transparently produced, and sustainably financed barrels. And that's our aspiration as Aradel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another round of applause for this beautiful family. And I'll tell you why I call them a family. You have the parent right here, an MPC, and then you have the children of different ages, and they're all doing very well. So that's an amazing place to be. So I would start with Mr. Adegbite, still on you, to really get insights into your experience in terms of the financing environment for indigenous operators. It's structurally different from that of the IOCs. Different cost of capital, different lenders, different governance expectations. So from your experience and your journey so far, what are those specific barriers you've encountered today? And what role does digital maturity and data transparency play in closing those financial gaps with international lenders?
I think it's important to establish that it's not a level playing ground in mobilizing capital between indigenous couples and international oil couples. The lay of the land is fundamentally asymmetric in ways that continue to compound against us indigenous operators at every step of the way. I'll mention 5 quick structural barriers or gaps that somehow militate against or present a different layer of challenge for indigenous operators over and beyond what the IOCs typically feel. The first one is the credit identity gap. You know, the international oil companies, Shell, Chevron, Mobil, they've got very significant balance sheets, solid market caps that gives them credibility and allows them to be able to raise capital at pace. For indigenous operators, we don't have that scale. Where you're looking at the Shell, the Chevrons of this world, you're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of the balance sheets with which they go to the market. We are not blessed with that. In fact, to make it worse, very few, if you look at the stable of indigenous operators we have in Nigeria today, only 3 are listed. Only 3 have got some level of publicly scrutinized, well-audited balance sheet that can form the basis of a decent conversation. And I'd like to thank Seplat for leading the way. Amongst the new ones, Oando was their grandfather from their prior downstream play. But in terms of upstream presence, it's Oando, it's Seplat, and ourselves. So when you look at that, how do you then raise capital on the credit of the sole Nigerian asset that we have? If you take an ExxonMobil, they've got assets all over the place. What we do is we have assets predominantly in one geography. It's in Nigeria. And with that, you have to deal with all the global issues around Nigeria. Nigeria's sovereign risk, Nigeria regulatory risk, and Nigeria currency risk. By the time financiers price that, they are pricing you at so many basis points above what your counterparties would source capital from. So we have that credit identity gap. The second one is around reserves and data credibility deficits. Today, the reporting standard for our reserves in Nigeria nationally is the NNS. Globally, it's not the NNS that is the basis. It's a more stringent PRMS reserves certification. And at times when you're speaking to international financiers, there are noses in the air when you start quoting your reserves on the basis of your NNS standards. And that counts against us, strictly speaking. So we need to think of that. Is the second structural barrier we're facing. The third one is what I would call the governance and institutional trust deficit. Again, I come back to the issue of a Seplat and Wando and an Aradel who are listed on the Nigeria Stock Exchange. What that does is to introduce a totally different level of governance oversight beyond what our regulators do. And that helps to repose certain level of comfort and confidence. The vast majority of our own indigenous operators don't have that privilege, and somewhat it introduces some trust deficit that is a structural barrier to raising international capital. The fourth one is the currency and reputation risk. For quite a number of us, we take facilities in dollars. In some instances, we earn revenue in naira. In an environment and a climate where your exchange rate is just dancing palongo all over the place, financiers are very, hesitant to want to take it. So beyond, and some financiers insist beyond you taking hedge protection against price, some will ask you to take hedge protection against currency fluctuation, and all that makes it much more expensive. So those are structural issues that make it a bit more challenging. The last one I'd like to speak about is on infrastructure, especially with respect to evacuation. We're talking about Oloibiri. 70 years ago, when the international oil companies came into our country, the architecture for exploiting resources here was built around an export focus. So everybody comes around and builds the coalition of their flow stations to terminate at a terminal, and then ships come and they take it away. Significantly, they de-risked a lot of evacuation challenges that we are facing today. Between then and now, we've had different laws and acts that have come into place that have mandated us to begin to play more domestically. The challenge with domestic play is infrastructure. And even the state of the export infrastructure we have today is not in the same space as what we had 70 years ago. 70 years ago, nobody was touching the pipelines. Today, every pipeline is a prime target. So we have that. And then if you're going to the same international market to raise capital as somebody else who is doing so in Angola, where it's not dealing with those issues, we have challenges. So those are structural gaps. And to the next part of your question as to how digital maturation and data transparency helps to close the gap. I think the first thing that the deployment of digital maturation does is to convert what is otherwise an opaque asset into investable assets. And Eleanor spoke about that when she was talking about the credibility of the data that you have. So when you move away from the traditional monthly manual reports, you have SCADA systems that give you real-time operation. When you move away from your annual recertification of your reserves, and you are dealing with continuously updated models using recent technology, when you move from spreadsheet-based decline curve analysis to AI-assisted dynamic reserves estimation, it builds a lot of confidence with financiers and helps to make what is otherwise an opaque asset to become more investable. And then it helps financiers to be able to truly place value. So digitization is not a nice to have. It's a way to de-risk some of this phobia and some of this black box around the assets that we have, and helps those who are taking decisions to finance us to truly see it for what it is. And then they're able to quantify financial impact. They're able to make reasonable predictions and projections, and we're in a better position then to earn the trust and the comfort to raise capital as indigenous company. That would be my response to your question.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Aradel, energized for a brighter future.